My name's Rick Simoneau, and a local J-boy, born and raised here in J. This is actually Little Falls, but J. And I guess I would be a fourth generation paper worker. My great-grandfather worked a short time when they first built the Otis Mill back in the late 1800s. Then my grandfather, Dona, got hired in 1908 and it's kind of a funny story. My brother somehow ran into one of his old pay stubs from 1908, and he was a water boy. So, of course, back in those days there was no fountains, so they actually went around the mill at the Otis Mill and delivered water. I'm guessing with some kind of a can or a jug or something. So he would have been in 1908, 16 years old, and he made 8 cents an hour. So it's kind of cool to have that pay stub. That it was actually at the Otis Mill, and I guess it was in one of the cabinets somewhere. It kind of shows you how things have changed over the years. He retired in 1957, I believe, so he worked close to 50 years. Started in 1908, retired in 57. The pay stub went from 8 cents an hour in 1908 to $3 or $4 and some odd cents in 57. Because shortly after that, the unions started, I think, forging ahead and getting better wages for the workers, and so things started getting better in the paper industry. I think it was tough going early on. And matter of fact, my father-in-law, Mimi Frechette, worked for Bass Shoe in the 60s. Well, he probably started in the 50s, 60s, and in the 70s he went into the International Paper, Androscoggin Mill. But he says back when he worked in the shoe shops, they were actually making more money than the paper mills because they had piecework. And so there was no incentive to go into the paper mills in the 50s and 60s. So a lot of people were working the shoe industry locally. And then as the wages got better in the paper industry, benefits get better, insurance and all that, he went, having raising 7 kids, went into the paper mill. My grandfather, because a lot of them came from Canada, and I'm sure you hear that on most of these stories. We're all immigrants here, and it's funny how our countries, we talk a lot about immigrants and refugees and all this, but we're really that's all we are. And so it's funny to kind of, if you walk the streets of Little Falls, Chisholm especially, and see the housing, how it was set up back in the day, and everybody knew everybody, and a lot of the folks just walked to work. My dad lived up over what's called Jewel Street, and I remember my mom sending us kids down with his lunch. It was just 150 yards down over the hill to the mill to bring him a hot meal. So my dad started in the mill during World War II. Matter of fact, I think he was gone for a few years during the wartime, left the mill, went to fight in World War II, came back to the Otis Mill. He retired in 1982, which was kind of awesome because for 2 reasons. I started in 1980, so I was always hoping I could work with my dad in the paper mill. So when I started in 80, I started on 4 and 5 finishing, which is, my dad was on number 3, and so I was determined. And at that time you bid jobs, so a job would come up and you'd bid on it, and if you had seniority enough, or if nobody else wanted the job, you got it. So I decided I was going to bid on number 3, wrapper, which my dad was foreman in that area, so Super Calendar area. So I did get a job, and I actually got to work for him, which is really cool. And then he retired in 1982 after working 43 years for International Paper. And again, during the early 80s, things were pretty good. I mean, the wages were still getting better. There was increases every year. Insurance was, you didn't pay anything for your insurance, unlike today. If anybody that's working knows, if you are fortunate enough to have insurance, you pay a lot, and the coverage is not nearly as good as it was back in the early 80s. So he retired. 85, was it 85 or 84? Or 83? Might have been 83. There was the first concessionary contract at Androscoggin hit. And already there was talk about 87, so a 4-year contract would take you to 87, that there was going to be a really tough contract, in which anybody that knows the history of the paper industry in our local area knows we had a strike in 87. So I went out on strike, had 3 young kids, wife and 3 young kids, but was determined to just keep doing what I've always had done, and that was to raise my family, feed my family, and do all the things that husbands do and wives do. So then I went to work for Simoneau, which is a local plumbing contractor, in 1987. Learned the plumbing trade, which was awesome. Worked with some great people. Norm St. Pierre was the owner of Simoneau. Now his son Aaron runs it. Great people. Learned the trade, but one thing that was becoming difficult for me at that time was 3 kids, very active in sports, church. It was getting tough with the travel, and he was starting to take jobs out of state. And I could see the writing on the wall that it was going to be stay away for 4 nights if I wanted to continue to work for him, or do something different. So at that point, Mike Luciano was the human resources manager at Otis Specialty Papers at that time. And he was calling some of the guys that were on strike to see if they'd consider going to work there. And I ended up, it was a tough decision, because I liked the idea of having shift work. Anybody that's worked shift work knows it can be demanding on the family. And now I'd worked 3 years as sleep at night and do all that sort of thing. And it was I enjoyed that. But the other part of it, I would be 7-8 minutes from home. I just live here in North J, so close to home. Yeah, the hours can be tough, but at least you're there, and you can be there for your family a little easier. So I ended up taking the job at the Otis in 1990, and 10 years. So no, I took it 90 to 97. Then 97, ended up going back, because my job, the way it worked at Androscoggin was, whatever your job was, they offered you bottom jobs in that department first, and then they worked up to your job. And when your job finally came available, you either accepted it or you declined it, and you were done. So in 97, my job came up, and I ended up going back. And I can remember the feeling the first time I walked through the doors, just going on a tour of the mill and not knowing hardly anybody, because it was just there was a lot of replacement workers in there. And so walking through like number 3 where my dad had worked, and literally not knowing one person. And it was I remember my stomach just twisting and thinking, oh, have I done the right thing? Because at the Otis, it was 250 people. Up there at that point was 1,200. And knew everybody at the Otis, and a lot of people were local. J. Livermore Falls, Wilton, Farmington. Now you're working with workers could be from Belgrade, could be from some Stratton, Eustis, coming from all over the state. So I doubted myself. I said, oh boy, did I do the right thing? Or did I do should I have stayed at the Otis? But I had a good friend of mine, Bill Igo, who actually was a mill manager at the Otis Mill, and he had told me, he says, this is an old mill. Androscoggin's a new mill. You're still young. Do you really think you want to? Because my wife, if it wasn't for my wife saying, think about it, Rick, that mill is 100 years plus old. is it going to be there when take you to retirement, which I'm 58 years old now. And so we talked long and hard about it, and I finally ended up going back. And as we know, the Otis Mill shut down, 9 years ago, whatever. And so it was the right decision. So I've thanked Bill since then for the for the words of wisdom. But the industry's changing. I'm still working. I'm a machine tender on number 5 paper machine. So it was 5 machines there back when it was built in the mid 60s. Now it's down to 2, and I've taken several walks through number 3 paper machine room. Which, have you had a chance to tour the Androscoggin Mill? You need to do that sometimes. To see these big paper machines, I'm talking big paper machines, just sitting there idle, and to know that between International Paper and Verso Paper, that they'd spend millions and millions and millions of dollars upgrading number 3. They had spent, I don't know, 200 million or some large amount of money to rebuild it back in the early 2000s, and to see it just sitting there it's pretty sad, and you hate to see that, but it's just the nature of the paper industry today. Fortunately for me, I work on number 5, which has always been specialty papers, and right now we're actually forging a way into the natural market, which is no bleach paper, no bleach process. It's all natural, coming right out of the pulp mill, and it's going fairly well. We're getting customers. I've got a son that works in the powerhouse. He's 37 years old, and I say to him, Andrew, keep your eyes open, because I honestly don't know if we're going to be here. That there's going to be a paper mill in Jay in 5-10 years. I hope so. Our community is kind of dependent on it over the last several years, and that's another piece of the whole story is, the local economy revolved around, the paper mills, Otis and Androscoggin, and now we're finding we're downsizing. The towns had to make some cuts, and it's tough to cut jobs. It's local people that are losing their jobs, and so we'll see where we're going to go forward in the town as far as the paper mill goes. I had a chance to be a selectman for 6 years back in the early 2000s, and that was just I could see the beginning of the downturn as International Paper sold the coated business, which IP, you probably know a little bit about IP. They're a big company, and they get out of the coated industry just in the nick of time, and they were smart in that they could see Amazon was going to be where it is today, and that you and I were going to order stuff from Amazon, and what does it come in? Boxes. So IP said coated paper, that people on their tablets, on their cell phones, and so we're going to be moving on from the coated industry, and they spun it off to what's now Verso. And Verso's trying to survive in the present market, and go in specialty grades. I mean, that's where it's at now. It's not, people don't buy magazines anymore, very, very few. So, my family came here from Canada. My grandfather lived in Livermore Falls, raised 10 kids. The paper industry has been good to my family. In any small community, whether it's Madawaska or Rumford, these big mills come in and set up shop, and you hope that it's going to keep hiring your local. And you hear it all the time. You hear in the news about LePage wants to keep the local kids instead of them heading off to San Diego and wherever they go. We want to keep them here. Well, we got to make sure there's jobs for them. And right now in this area, there's jobs, Lewiston, Auburn. But if you want to stay in J. Livermore Falls, you're going to be traveling, some. So I just hope it keeps going, and and that my future is bright here. And hate to see that, as you walk through a paper mill. Like I had a chance to go to the Otis shortly after they shut down down there, and it was sad to see that because like I said, my grandfather worked there, my father worked there, and I actually worked there, and my two sons worked there. So we all had a chance to be part of that. See, most of the then there was a strike in the 20s. I think it was 21, and a lot of them traveled back to Canada, is what I've heard, to cut wood, because there wasn't much work here. But most of them came. Have you had a chance to see the DVD of what's the name of it? Down by the River, a local. Yeah, it might be something you'd be interested in. You can ask Sherry about it. I'm sure she has it. It kind of gives a little bit of the immigration part of the mill being built back in the late 1800s, and how that all evolved, how the different nationalities came to Chisholm, Little Falls, to build the mill and then to work in the mill. And so the mill was built in 65, so I went to work in 80, so the mill's only 15 years old. So it's a big facility with good paying jobs right at home. I'm sure a lot of the local parents was telling their kids, go be a doctor, a lawyer, don't work in the paper mill because it's tough hours, it's demanding at times, it's not that easy of a job at times. But for us, my dad and mom never said, you need to go in the paper mill, or you ought to go in the paper mill. I guess it's something I thought I would do. And there's other opportunities in the paper industry too. I mean, back in the 90s, they were offering some college if you wanted to, to become management, if you wanted to do something different in the industry. So there is opportunities, or there was, not so much now. But now I'm winding down, 4 years to go. I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. But my hope and prayer for the kids, and that's another thing that they're finding over here, is they're not getting young people to come in anymore. So it's an aging mill. Obviously, a lot of the guys came in 1987, so that puts them in the 54-5 range. They came in at 18, 20. But at some point, if they turn this around, which, they're optimistic that it's going to happen, they've got to get some young people in. And so it's got to be that situation where the mill is stable again, because they've shut 3/5 of it down. And so now everybody that's looking from the outside in is saying, boy, do I want to go get a job there, work 2 or 3 years, and then I'm out on the street looking for a job again. So that's the challenge I think that management has and Verso has in the communities that they have mills. Is it going to be sustainable? Is it going to be, is this mill going to be running 25 years from now? If they don't maintain it, if they don't, upgrade some things, it won't be. But if they do, we've got plenty of wood here. That's another piece of the thing. I remember back in the 80s when I started, the talk was 25 years, no more wood. Because that's when there was mills in Millinocket and, Bucksport and all over the place. And so they're worried about the wood. Now there's more, they say there's more wood in the state of Maine than there ever was. So I just hope that, that we have jobs for our kids, that the community can get back to where it was, and maybe they'll start number 3 machine back up. I mean, it's sitting there, and I've heard rumors recently, but how rumors go in a small town, that they've talked about maybe starting 3 back up, that Sappy up in Hinckley is going to need pulp, and they don't have the capacity for their heavyweight liner that they're going to be making after the first of the year. So there's rumors going around they're going to start 3 back up. I hope so. We'll see. It's been good here. No, I have no regrets. I've raised my 3 kids, and one of them's still in Wilton. 2 of them are, one's in San Diego, one's in Westbrook, and 6 grandkids. So it's all good.